Desmond's Flicks is made possible by the incredible support from the Patreon community. If you'd like to help support the channel and keep it going, consider becoming a Patreon today. Link is in the description below. Plus, you'll gain access to awesome perks. Now let's get into the video. Queen of the Damned was released in 2002 and was directed by Michael Reimer and stars Aaliyah and Stuart Townsend. The film is loosely based on Anne Rice's 1988 novel The Queen of the Damned from the Vampire Chronicles series, as well as elements from the 1985 novel The Vampire Lestat. The film went on to gross a modest $45.5 million at the box office on a $35 million budget. Before we go any further, I will be going into full plot spoilers. So if you'd like to avoid these spoilers, skip ahead to the timestamp on screen. The vampire Lestat awakens from his slumber by a rock band rehearsing in his old home. He assumes the role of their lead singer and achieves international success. During an interview promoting his live concert, Lestat reveals the existence of vampires. A researcher for a paranormal group named Jessie Reeves sees one of Lestat's music videos play on MTV. She tells others in the group that she believes Lestat really is a vampire. David Talbot, Jessie's mentor, tells her they know Lestat is a vampire and that he was turned by a vampire named Marius. David then gives Jessie Lestat's journal to read, under one condition: that she promises to never return to the Admiral's arms. In his journal, Lestat writes about he was turned by Marius and how he awoke the first vampire, Kasha, through his music. Jessie isn't satisfied with what she read and tracks down Lestat, leading her to a vampire club in London called the Admiral's Arms. She's later saved by Lestat from vampires who attempt to attack her for asking about Marius. Marius visits Lestat in LA to warn him other vampires will not tolerate his public persona. Marius then reveals that Akasha is awake because of Lestat's music and begs him to cancel the concert, which Lestat refuses. Meanwhile, Akasha arrives at the Admiral's Arms looking for Lestat. When the vampires reveal they plan to kill Lestat, she burns down the club with all the vampires inside. Jessie goes to LA to give Lestat his journal back. She then proceeds to ask him what being a vampire is like. Jessie then asks Lestat to turn her, saying she wants to be with him and to know everything he does. Lestat refuses and shows her what it's like to feed on a human, then asks her if she really wants to be a vampire. Later, a group of vampires attack Lestat while performing at the concert, but both Marius and Lestat fend off the vampires until Akasha makes her entrance and takes Lestat with her. She brings him home where the two get all freaky deaky in a tub full of blood and rose petals. Akasha places a spell on Lestat and proclaims him her new king. After the concert, Jessie is taken by her aunt, Maharet, to her home where she reveals herself to be an ancient vampire. The other ancient vampires discuss their plan to destroy Akasha by draining her of her blood to prevent her from taking over the world. Lestat and Akasha then confront the ancient vampires. Akasha commands Lestat to kill Jessie when the ancient vampires refuse to join her. He obeys, but after drinking Jessie's blood, comes to his senses and is released from Akasha's spell. He demands his crown, and Akasha offers him her arm to feed on. Lestat then begins to drain Akasha's blood with the help of the other ancients. As her power diminishes, Maharet takes the last bit of Akasha's blood, killing her. Maharet then turns into a marble statue to become the new Queen of the Damned. Lestat goes to Jessie and gives her his blood. Lestat and Jessie then visit David to return Lestat's journal. David asks what it's like to be a vampire, to which Jessie offers to turn him, but David states that he's too old for immortality. Jessie bids David goodbye with an embrace, but David recoils in fear. Although hurt, Jessie nods in understanding and leaves with Lestat. Moments later, Marius greets David. The film ends with Lestat and Jessie walking hand in hand into the night. Queen of the Damned is an incredibly flawed film that feels stuck in the early 2000s. But that's not to say I didn't have a ton of fun with it. On the contrary, it's a bit of a guilty pleasure. Yes, it's a total mess and nowhere near as good as Interview with the Vampire. Thankfully, the cast chewed up the scenery, specifically Townsend and Aaliyah. Aaliyah's performance is a lot of fun. She seemed to be having a blast playing the villain, even if her accent wasn't the best. Townsend also seemed to be reveling in his role as Lestat, even though I preferred Tom Cruise's performance more in Interview with the Vampire. Queen of the Damned feels like a long-form music video you would have seen on MTV's TRL back in the day, which adds a bit of charm to it. The film also moves along briskly, which is both a positive and a negative. Positive because we don't spend a ton of time going through mindless exposition dumps, but also negative due to the lack of development for the character of Jesse, who somehow Lestat feels the need to turn. I get that Lestat was under Akasha's spell, so developing the relationship between the two of them isn't as pertinent to the storyline. But with Jesse, it all feels so forced. I also wasn't a fan of the voiceovers from both Lestat and Jesse. It seems so random when these voiceovers would be used, and they aren't framed in a way that makes sense as to why we're hearing their inner thoughts. With the Interview with the Vampire, Louis is recounting his life as a vampire up until the point of the interview with the journalist. In Queen of the Damned, we don't have that framing device, and it feels out of place. The special effects are decent, although some of the CGI hasn't aged very well, which is par for the course with the early 2000s CGI. The soundtrack is a total throwback to high school and college for me, with the lead singer of Korn, Jonathan Davis, lending his vocals for Lestat's band. There's also bands such as Papa Roach, Disturbed, and Earshot that perfectly illustrate that late 90s and early 2000s nu metal movement. For those wondering why Aaliyah is absent from the soundtrack, Jonathan Davis and Aaliyah had originally planned to do a recording together, but unfortunately, due to her passing, this was not able to happen. With all that said, I'm going to give Queen of the Damned a weekend rental. I don't dislike this movie, but I don't feel that it's aged very well. However, I will say that it was fun to revisit this film after having not seen it since the cinema nearly 20 years ago. If you've never seen Queen of the Damned or haven't seen it in a long time, it's streaming now for free on Tubi.